It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Amina Yaqin today, who's going to talk about her recent book. Professor Amina Yaqin is a world and post-colonial literature, is a prof of world and post-colonial literature at the University of Exeter. Her major publications include Gender, Sexuality and Feminism in Pakistani Audio Writing, which is, I think, is the book that she's going to be talking about today. Framing Muslim Stereotyping and Representations After 9/11, co-authored with Professor Peter Mori, and the co-edited Contesting Islamophobia, Anti-Muslim Prejudice in Media, Culture and Politics. She has published widely in peer-reviewed journals and edited special issues. Her commentary and interviews have been aired by the BBC, Sky News, Euronews, TRT World, France 24, Indus News, Pakistan Television Network, etc. And she has written for the National UAE, the Times Higher Education UK, the Daily Pioneer, the British Film Institute, and The Conversation. She is founding co-editor of the journal Critical of Pakistan Studies and co-founding and co-editor of the book series Global Textualities, Multicultural and Transcultural Narratives, published by Manchester University Press. Currently, she is a co-director of the Arts and Humanities AHRC-funded research project Empathy, Narrative and Cultural Values. Prior to joining Exeter, she worked at SOAS, University of London, where she founded the Center for the Study of Pakistan and co-founded the Center for Gender Studies and Center for English Studies. She has led on curriculum changes and was a founding member of the Decolonizing the University Working Group. It gives me great pleasure to welcome her today and to hear more about her great book. Welcome, Dr. Amina Yaqin.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Farah, and thank you to all my wonderful hosts at LUMS, Dr. Sabah, Dr. Tom, Dr. Farooq. It's such a pleasure to be back here and an honor as well. And thank you to all of you for coming today to hear me out. It's also very generous of LUMS to host this book talk because the book came out a couple of years ago, and I was saying to Dr. Farah, I'm slightly worried that whether people will think this is a genuine reason for me to have a book talk. But I did a series of talks last year, and I've still got the title slide from there, and I've got my title wrong there as well, so it's no longer associate professor, it is professor, and it's world and post-colonial literatures, as Dr. Farah said. But what I thought I would begin with is just picking up the title, Gender, Sexuality and Feminism in Urdu Writing, and the image, which is from Naiza Khan's wonderful series, Henna Hands. And Naiza was kind enough to let me use the image, or she's extremely generous, and she said, it's yours, you can do with it what you want. But the reason why I was drawn to it was because, to me, it spoke quite a bit to some of the things that I wanted, that the book had picked up already. So henna, especially as a metaphor and also as a theme, is present in the world of Urdu poetry particularly, and it's used by different people at different times, the resonance of it. And also it's something that's present in our everyday lives as women and men in Pakistan, I think, as a kind of dye, as color, as decorative sort of art, or as a healing. It's a really sort of ancient tradition. So what I had, because my book engages quite a lot with how Pakistani Urdu writing and is in the 20th century, the legacy of feminist poets in the 20th century. I ended up engaging quite a bit with the project of modernity. So although modernity is not in the title. It's kind of something that gets picked up quite a lot in the introduction and throughout the book. And henna also is subject to that modernity, to that narrative of modernity. So I will just take you back to somebody like Altaf Hussain Hali, who is, if you've done the Urdu curriculum at some point here, you will have come across Hali's work, right? And you will have read maybe Chup Ki Daad, Homage to the Silent, or the Musaddas or something. But Hali was also a modernizer. He was also somebody who was quite instrumental in the way Urdu was changing during the colonial period. And he especially had an influence, along with Maulana Azad as well, an influence on the ghazal, the form of the ghazal. So that is the form in which I was thinking about henna in relation to quite a lot. So for example, one of the 20th century poets who I study and devote a chapter to in this book, Kishwar Nahid, has a couplet which references henna and talks about the paleness of henna on the hands of the poet, of the female poet. And it brings up a woman's narrative, I argue, especially because it's not about how henna is making her more desirable. It's about how the henna has faded from her hands. So it's a different kind of rendition. And why I brought up Hali was because there's a connection there. So, and the form of the love lyric. So Kishwar Nahid is writing this in the form of the love lyric, the ghazal, and Hali was the modernizer who had to work, who decided to reform the Urdu ghazal and say, okay, when we use things like language in the ghazal, it has to be simplified. It can't have aspects of the body and sexuality and decoration or things that are sort of, well, some might call it frivolous, some might call it, the jingling of the bells or anything that brings to mind a certain kind of gendering. So it was about just changing that language and modernizing it. So henna at that point in the 19th century was going through a transformation in terms of how poets could represent it in the form of the ghazal. So previously it may have been represented as in a context of how you might read the ghazal more erotically, but here the ghazal was being simplified and the reader was being told not to read it erotically, to read it in a more modern way, to read it in a more kind of sensible way. So that was, a very long, complicated introduction to why the image of henna hands really spoke to me. And Naiza, of course, did something very different with this. She was painting this in Karachi and in public places, and it was about the lived experience. And when she was talking about it to me, she did, I was quite interested. I said, well, what were people's reactions to this? Because, you're sort of doing it around railway stations and in areas where this is not really something that people might be exposed to on an everyday basis. So she said there was kind of some, it wasn't generally sort of welcomed that much. And they were, what happens with street art or what you do on the sort of, it becomes graffitied, right? So it becomes part of the narrative of the city, but it becomes different, it changes. And I think that really appealed to me. So although you don't have that sort of transformed version of henna hands on there, but what it did for me was it reminded me of that why, Urdu poetry is part of our everyday life in Pakistan and across South Asia generally. It's the language that we think in, or the emotional language that we connect with. So it'll be something that will connect both the elites and people in their everyday lives who are working on the ground, from rickshaw drivers to, you will see verses on the backs of rickshaws, and across the country from Peshawar to Karachi, it's everywhere. And politicians will use it to convince us to vote for them as well, right? So Urdu poetry has very useful functions in lots of places. And it's also a place of resistance and a place of imagining the new nation and reimagining it and transforming it in lots of ways. So the 20th century is an interesting time for Urdu poetry, I thought, to look at this and to think about all these questions of gender, sexuality, and feminism in the book. So I'll just sort of, to tell the story of Urdu poetry, I have to talk about a little bit of, in my introduction, the mystical, devotional, lyric poetry contexts as well, because it is about, gender is not straightforward. So although we do gender heavily in Urdu, right? We can't speak without gendering. I can't call the table a table without telling you it's gender, right? But at the same time, it's not to say that what is male and female is just what it seems. Because in Urdu poetry traditionally, and also in mystical poetry particularly, that relationship has been very complex, and it's been about lots of different kinds of genders within those identifications of male and female. So and the Sufi feminine is a very strong concept and goes back to an earlier period and a medieval period as well. And it also connects with the tradition of people like Mirabai and others who have written devotional poetry and been sort of writing in the path of God. So I think I didn't want to sort of say that this is a thing that only 20th century women can do. They're the only people who can write and be published. No, it has been done before, and it's been done in different ways and different contexts. But it's about, like I said, the connection is the narrative of modernity and how we understand it and how we sort of develop it, and also that relationship between Islam and the nation in terms of if you equate the secular with the modern, and you equate the secular and the modern with the nation, and you equate Islam with the sacred and not the nation but the community, right? Then you sort of see them as two separate things. But scholars have showed us and demonstrated that the two are interconnected and can be interconnected, and some of this is to do with the legacy of European modernity, which does kind of say that the secular and sacred, it's the separation of the church and the state. The two can't coexist. But in Islamic thought, it can be argued or has been argued differently, and scholars like Dalal Asad and others have sort of presented that context. Anyway, but that's a small part of the story. So it's a very important connection, and especially for a poet that I look at in detail, Fehmida Riaz, for example. When I explore her story in depth in the book, I think the mystical connection is really important. It's important for all of them, but for her, I think you can't really understand her ethos if you don't understand that connection between Sufi thought and the secular nation. It's hard to fathom her. And she's also very, very influenced by Zoroastrianism, and that is something that she turns to more, I think, specifically later on in her life. I don't look at that aspect. So the other thing is about the gaps in this book, right? I can't explain everything that all the poets do. I have to choose the story I choose to tell you. So this was a story I wanted to tell about these poets and what they were doing. And therefore, the form was very important, and the performativity. Now, I think when I was kind of developing the book and thinking about it, I had the opportunity to meet somebody, a major poet like Zehra Nigah, who is one of the pioneers of amongst the women poets. And she told me the story, which I'm sure if you've been to one of her events, you will have heard her recite this anyway. where she said that because she was quite a sensation when she started out as a poet. She was very young, she was a teenager, she was performing to sold out audiences in places like the Alhambra, so you can imagine 16-year-old in the 1960s in Lahore and all of this stuff happening. And but she also said there were quite interesting things retrospectively that happened when she had to present and perform her poetry, because she would perform in tarannum, right, to sing it, I suppose is the best way I could translate it. And she said that there was an occasion where in a women's college, you know, the men were all sort of put in parda, and she as a woman was sort of more open to the audience. But the thing that stayed with me was one of the things that she said she was advised by her male advisors or her well-wishers, if you, you know, colleagues. I think she was advised not to raise her hand in to say adab when she got sort of when she finished reciting her poetry and the audience was, you know, expressing their admiration and vahva and all of that. So they said, don't do that, because if you do that, you will be seen, you will be equated with courtesan culture. And so the adab, so that was something that was really interesting for me. And I was like, how, you know, is that? Because here is this middle class, elite middle class woman, and she's being told that you are going to be equated with courtesan culture because of this one adab hand gesture in a public mehfil, right? So to try and understand, you know, what leads to that kind of cultural sensitivity and thinking, I decided to do quite a lot of digging and talking to people with regards to what is it that makes people judge women in that way and to assess them in that way in a public form. And of course then, you know, the whole story is that women poets are not the norm. They are not performing in the public spaces. They do that after 1947. You know, you've got the story of the Zenana, and I'll come to that in a minute. But I think also what's important for me with regards to the ghazal and the mushaira tradition is Urdu poetry is a public, it has to be performed in a mushaira space, right? For its kind of, to continue its living form in the way that it's intended, it needs the mushaira. And therefore, the female poet can write in her room and just sort of publish and be read separately. But if she's excluded from that kind of participation, then it's not a full acknowledgement of her presence in the canon of Urdu poetry. It always puts her on the margins. So how do you bring somebody from the margins into the center? And this is what these kind of women had to negotiate. And Zehra Nigah is very traditional and definitely understands all those nuances and all those suggestivenesses, and is not radical in the same way that somebody like Fehmi Daryaz was, or even Kishwa Nahid is to that extent. So it's also about trying to understand the different voices that are coming through as they're telling the story. And I come to my next point, which is about voice, language, and form. So to think about this kind of context of voice, I really wanted to go back to the past of Urdu and look at the stories that normalize women for us, right? So I'm sure most of you will be familiar with Akbari and Asghari, the story, right? Nazir Ahmed's Miratul Arus. Behishti Zever is a book that's handed out at weddings, I think still is. It's a different, like that's a religious guidebook, a textbook. That is a novel. Jan Ada is a novel. They're different guys. So I'm doing all the wrong things, right? I'm mixing up genres that I shouldn't be mixing up, and I'm doing all of this. And I've also looked at a diary, which was written by Nazir Ahmed's granddaughter, travel writing in this chapter, because I wanted to see what was happening with voice in Urdu. And in the colonial period, the British were really wanted, the Zenana was this kind of space, like, we need to get into this space, this is the space we can't get into. And what's the best way of getting into this space is to also, what's the best way of creating a new public? Women are the new public as well. So there are people like Sarojini Cornelia Sorabji and some of the other kind of people who are writing in English who play quite a big role in that, and Antoinette Burton has written on that about dwelling in the archives and stuff like that. And they have an interesting relationship to this narrative. But what I wanted to do was to look at it specifically in the context of Urdu and see what was happening. So there were some prizes, and we come to that sort of thing about literary prizes and how they increase the circulation of texts amongst a reading public. And here you have a kind of texts at reading publics which were quite small and concentrated in pockets, but you also have the British bringing in the printing presses, so you have then mass printing going on, so you suddenly have a greater circulation of texts. And so Miratul Arus, which starts off just as kind of these narratives read to in sort of small gatherings, becomes this novel, is kind of submitted for a literary prize, gathers a literary prize, becomes like this best-selling textbook, and it's really interesting when you look at how he develops voice in that story as well, because I mean, I won't bore you with my discussion about the form of the novel, because it's sort of still developing at this point. It's not fully, it's a mixture of the Dastan tradition, the oral tradition, and the prose tradition, etc. And Nazir Ahmed himself is a bit of an atheist, right? So it's like, how is this stuff happening in Urdu, and how is this kind of representation of the good woman and the bad woman being constantly reproduced? So what that text does is what it does, but people often don't really read texts closely and analyze them in their original form. They often are looking at adaptations or representations. So what you have is like the Miratul Arus story reproduced ad nauseum in Pakistan. If you've watched Pakistani Urdu drama, every other story is an Akbari Asghari story, whether you put the name on it or not, that's a major influence. But it depends on the writer, right? How are they going to tell this story? And writers often choose, depending on which stage of politics Pakistan is in, to either be regressive or progressive. So what I found in the 2000s is it was tending more towards the regressive side rather than the progressive side. But those are cycles in life, and they sort of happen everywhere. Behishti Zever was again a different kind of text, and it gives out. What I was interested in was these male authors using the feminine voice. How are they using voice? How are they inflecting this voice? And so when you're reading it as your reading public is women who are reading this and kind of identifying with it as women. So that's where they're very successful, where these texts are really successful. And what I found quite interesting, to contrast with Nazir Ahmed's granddaughter's diary of when she travels to Oxford on a scholarship from Hyderabad to study English literature. So it's quite interesting, because she talks about the different groups of people that she's meeting and she's engaging with as an Indian in the UK. And it's quite an anthropological diary, in the same way that you would say white narratives exoticize people from the East, in a similar kind of way. It also does a bit of myth busting, like this is what I thought Britain was and this is what it came across, or this is, some of the myths kind of reproduced and some of them not reproduced. But what she does give us is a little bit of an insight into Nazir Ahmed's atheism, which I think is quite interesting because that's not something that gets picked up with those texts. But that was something that Ashraf Ali Thanvi, who wrote Behishti Zevar, was very aware of. So what I wanted to do was I was contrasting that Deobandi tradition that Thanvi was coming out of with the Aligarh tradition to show that these are the kind of different kinds of voices that exist. And so how do we as readers think through them, and when we get to these conversations with the women writers that I'm talking about. And I think it's also important to just have some like oversight of Urdu as a modern language and what it's, there are different stories, and I'm not going to kind of tell you the story of Urdu here, of the Urdu Mualla or the camp or whatever. But I think the literary canon of Urdu very much relies on the Urdu Mualla tradition, so, which is associated with the Mughals, and it comes to prominence in the middle to late 18th century. And the British also buy into the literary tradition quite a lot, and because, you know, literature is so useful in terms of cultural values, of imparting cultural values, and we know the story of English education in India and how cultural values are communicated through the English language. So in the same way, they also recognize the importance of the local language as well. And of course, it's about removing Persian, right, as the language of power, and it's about sort of associating and building different relationships. So the title of Shamsul Ulama was awarded to the highly learned, and the people that were recipients of this included people like Nazir Ahmed. So I just want you to think about all these writers in that sort of, you know, power dynamic, that they're not exactly independent of the colonial state, that they have a strong relationship there as well. Now, like I said, it's 20th century women are not the only women who write this stuff. And going back to the courtesan reference that I made with Zehra Nigah, and this is goes back to the fact that the first published collection in print form that we have of a woman's divan in Urdu is available in the British Library by Malaka Baichanda, which was her Takhallus. And I think there is another one that has been found by someone and they're working on it, but this is the one that I've seen. And this is present in the British Library because it was presented to the resident of Hyderabad, John Malcolm, and he obviously then deposited it with the archives, with the colonial archives, and therefore there is evidence that we have it. So we don't always have evidence of everything that was present and done. It's sort of, anyway. So that story of Malaka Baichanda is something that is adapted by Mirza Hadi Ruswa in his book Umrao Jan Ada. And Umrao Jan Ada, the novel, is very different to Nazir Ahmed's Miratul Arus because it sort of does experimentations with form. It uses the love lyric in it, and it again ventriloquizes the female voice of the courtesan. But again, I think it falls within the pattern of modernity because it, you know, whatever her story, whatever her difficulties, whatever her challenges as a courtesan, in the end, you know, and I'm sorry for this spoiler if you haven't read it, she becomes pious at the end, and that is her salvation. And that's, you know, the message that if you want to think about it. So, so reform was a big theme, and the Zenana was a target for reform because this is a place that is dark. These women, they're not out getting educated, although women are getting educated in the Zenana, right? It's a different form of education. It's a homeschooling thing, but it is, of course, has its limitations in terms of participating in public life and of cohabitation across sort of two spheres. So there is a shift then in the elite classes taking part in political life, and the story of two poets that you can look at or think about is Zahida Khatun Sherwania, who wrote under a pseudonym, didn't write under her own name because her family didn't want to see her name out there in published form. And she only wrote from within the Zenana. She didn't write from outside. And then the other person is Fatima Soghra Haya, and she was from Lucknow. And she wrote devotional writing as well as other forms. Again, public dissemination wasn't something that was welcomed so much by the family, although, there's a number of years that are separating these writings. And she also had some mental health problems as well. So her kind of story also gets a little bit sort of shunted into the ether, as it were. We have these kind of writers, but we don't really talk about them because they're not that present, they're not that visible. They're the invisible, I call them the invisible women writers, who are the predecessors to the ones that we see in the 20th century. So then you have, I think I couldn't tell the story of 20th century feminist poetry without talking about the progressives, the 1930s, what happened, we go back to that point about realism and reality with a vengeance, and the influence of communism, psychoanalysis, anti-fascism, this kind of, I won't sort of go into all of the progressive story. Happy to pick it up in the Q&A if you like. But the two women who get talked about with the progressive writers, of course, are Rashid Jahan and later Ismat Chughtai. So Rashid Jahan's Parda, the short story, and Ismat Chughtai's Lihaf are very, very well known and are written about, quite massively. And they were prose writers who challenged conventional narratives about women, and they were taking on what the progressives said about making, about sort of writing about everyday problems for women. I think with Rashid Jahan, because she was a doctor as well, she was able to talk about women's issues, as it were, to do with fertility that hadn't been talked about before. But I think she didn't do what Ismat Chughtai did in terms of what she did with Lihaf, with the story of same-sex desire, and told through the eyes of a child. So it's a really, it sort of sets the tone for something that she herself found very challenging in her career as well, because she went on to write quite a lot of other things, major novels, but that's the story she's always measured by. And that frustrated her as well, because it sort of brought a lot of challenges in her personal life. It nearly broke down her marriage. And the kind of vitriol and the judgment, as well as the court case and everything that came with it, there was a high price to pay for that story. But it's also about writing an offense. When you write, you cause offense. And it was about how sexuality, when matters of sexuality were suddenly, people were getting offended through the religious narrative rather than through openly calling out. I think that we can't really write about sexuality openly. It was about, this has offended religious sensibilities, so the colonial state will also intervene because, we are not here to offend religious sensibilities. We want to have tolerance and a just society. So therefore, it's all contradictory stuff, but still, it's worth remembering in terms of how this was built up and how people were arguing against it. So I think Ismat Chughtai's short story, also it created a rift within the progressives, because the progressives were suddenly confronted with, now we have to really think. It started with the first collection of short stories, Angare, in which the sexuality stories were more problematic. And here again, so there was already starting to be a slight shift within the progressives. It's like there are some topics that will remain taboo. We can talk about a lot of topics, but some topics will remain off the books. And this became one of those ones. So, you know, Manto and Chughtai were like on the borders, on the fringes of that group. Sorry, that slide should have come earlier, but anyway. So just, you know, the story of Pakistani Urdu, I'm sort of sure. So this book those are the first chapters and the initial kind of stages of the book, the first 3 chapters, and the sacred secular ideologies. And what I'm interested in doing in this book is, when it comes to the story of these poets in Pakistan, is how are they navigating the sacred and the secular in their writings. And they're not taking just one side or the other side. You know, they are actively engaging in a dialogue through their writing. And it is in a country where it's not always possible to write your story, to write your history openly without getting into trouble for it. You know, these are the sort of different places where you do find the alternative stories of the nation. So through both, and I don't just read everything through the nation, you know, that is a little bit limiting. I do read it in other ways as well. But I think I just wanted to underline that those are some of the things that continue to make their presence felt within Pakistan, the Deoband, the Aligarh, the Islamism, you know, it sort of becomes then, we've got the big Cold War politics and the closure of the left in the 1970s and 80s, which is where I'm really sort of heading towards, and the women's movement. So the women's, now, feminism is a title of my book, and I could have gone through a lot of theories of feminism, but I chose not to, which can land me in a lot of trouble. And I mean, it's not that I don't know the theories, and there are lots of people and academics and scholars who've written these theories, but I really wanted to look at it through the women's movement, through the narratives of the poets, and rather than impose a kind of top-down definition of feminism, this is what I think feminism is, and this is how it gets defined. I wanted the poetry to define it for me. So it's not always successful, but I try. So you can read it and tell me if it works. But the 1980s were a kind of watershed moment in the story of women's rights and the Hudud ordinances and protest marches, the formation of the Women's Action Forum, and the use of poetry as resistance. So somebody like Habib Jalib and Faiz Ahmed Faiz, they were big figures, right? And they were sort of huge resistance figures as well, and their poetry was being recited on the streets. But, you know, they say behind every great man there is a woman. So there were lots of women behind these great men as well, you know, not just their wives, but the sort of poets and the other sort of members of the Urdu literary community, you know, a community which doesn't always welcome everybody and is quite selective and has different groupings, and it's quite a like tight community to get into, and there are lots of gatekeepers. So you have these different women, Fahmida Riaz, Kishwar Nahid, Ada Jafri, Parveen Shakir, Sara Shagufta, and I think I've got a picture of Rashid Jahan as well. It's in there. So it was just looking at those stories and how were they changing the narrative. And just to give you a little bit of a sample of some of the poems some of the topics and the themes that are addressed in their poetry. So one, for example, Zehra Nigar writes about Samjhota. And I thought this is a wonderful poem because, you know, every time you, in life in general, everything is about compromise, right? And in your personal life, in your political life, in your whatever life. But when you're young and you're ambitious and you think you rule the world, you know, compromise doesn't mean much. And you look at it through the eyes of Zehra Nigar, and you're like, okay, I kind of get it, but is this what I want to read? Is this what I really want to read as a young person? Right. So मुलायम गर्म समझौते की चादर, ये चादर मैंने बरसों में बुनी है, कहीं भी सच के गुलबूटे नहीं हैं, किसी भी झूठ का टांका नहीं है. So you know, it's a beautiful poem in terms of the way she manages the language and writes about it. But I can't imagine young people picking this up and saying, "Oh yes, I'm for this. I'm gonna like totally go for it." I mean, you know, my teenagers would absolutely kind of put it down and say no. But this was, you know, a really important voice, and she was kind of articulating something that was representative of a middle-class woman and the role that she had to play in terms of managing the house, of managing the family, of managing the finances. So if you go back to Nazir Ahmed and the Akbari Asghari story, right, it's not just the good woman, bad woman story. It's a story of the good woman managing the household finances as well, whose husband isn't able to do the work that will bring in the income to the family. So it's about the change, that whole shift, you know, in terms of a working family and who brings economic power in. Whether that economic power gets recognition or not is another thing. And of course, Zehra Nigah had stopped working when she stopped writing when she was married. She didn't write for nearly 25 years, and she doesn't really talk about it that much, but she devoted herself to her family, and then she started writing again. Fahmida Riaz, you know, it's sad that she's not with us anymore, but she is a very different person altogether. Fahmida is, of course, a journalist. She is a poet. She is also a chronicler, a writer. She writes about, and she is based as someone based in Karachi as well. So my poets are not all based in Lahore, in the Punjab. You know, they're also in Sindh and in coming and absorbing some of those multilingual influences from those places. But Fahmida Riaz had a sort of also, she was a progressive, so she was very much on the left. She was a Marxist. But she also wrote this collection of poems, Badan Darida, The Body Torn, which spoke about things like women's menstruation, that spoke about woman intimacy during pregnancy, the act of kissing, all those taboo topics that you would not, that Urdu is very genteel as a language, and as the gatekeepers of Urdu will sort of protect it from that. So that's the kind of stuff you might go to watch in Punjabi theatre in Lahore, but you wouldn't necessarily pick up a book of poetry and say, yeah, I'm going to look for that in there, because you know you're not going to find it most of the time. So it was, you know, so she did that book, and she did that collection, and she was very, I think she was a bit bitter. She was like, you know, people have called me a whore, and they've called me this, and you know, I'm always judged on what I wrote, although she went on to write a lot of things. And she did get recognition, and she did get sort of from the state, she did get recognition. But of course, in the 1980s, she got into a lot of trouble because she was publishing the magazine, Awaz, exactly. And they were, on the face of it, it was a literary magazine, but it wasn't really, it was a political magazine, right? And so there were lots of cases of sedition, so she had to go out of the country, and she went to India. And then, of course, she's seen as anti-national, and that is the cross she has to bear throughout her career when she comes back to Pakistan as well. So whenever you say something that doesn't fit, you know, you are an anti-national. You don't belong. You're an outsider. You're not an insider. I mean, she's a migrant as well from India. A lot of the population in Pakistan are migrants from India after partition. So so there is that, you know, relationship of being an outsider, insider, and then how do you fit in within a place like Karachi? And then she had an interesting experience. She was very political. She did have an affiliation with the People's Party, although when I remember when I used to have conversations with her, and I did put this question to her, and I was like, no. I was like, okay. So it's really, you know, but that's the nature of interviewing people. They will say different things, and yeah, you have to figure it out at some point through the archives and through the narratives, etc. But she also, what she was doing, I think, in her poetry was she was acting as a witness to what was happening in the state, and she was telling that narrative in. So apart from Badan Darida, if you read her other books of poetry, other volumes of poetry, you do get the story of what's going on, for example, in Karachi with the the militarized presence. And also she was quite interested in climate and the change and the increasing city sort of demolition of the more kind of the structures, as it were, and the buildings and the, well, that's the story of Karachi, right? The buildings and the takeover and of land and land acquisition without justice I mean, we've got a sort of similar story in Lahore now with all the development that's taken place. And it was very hard to tell that story without being targeted by people within Karachi. So she has interesting ways of how she puts it, and different people. I mean, Parveen Rahman, for example, paid a very heavy price for doing that work in Karachi. So Fahmida was doing that work, but she was doing it in the form of poetry, in the form of prose, in a sort of way that was less visible, because I think because of her experiences that she'd had with the state, she was perhaps a little bit more aware of what she needed and how she needed to communicate and do these kinds of things. And she did say that I am tired of the metaphor and the symbol, and I'm going to stop writing poetry. And then tragically her son died in a swimming accident, and then she comes back to poetry with this collection called Tum Kabir. But she also does these wonderful, Sheikh Saadi and sort of stories for children and etc. So there's a whole, I kind of try and cover the thing. And what I was quite interested in her poems was to try and the secular, the sacred comes through in the way that she uses some references to the Quran and people's relationship to, like, for example, the Surah Yasin poem that she writes. If you read it, you might think, what's this got to do with Surah Yasin? It's got nothing to do. It's about a woman walking home at night. What's the connection, right? But she's using the images, the night, sort of the context of the night, the different the way that the surah works, and she's using the cultural context of the surah to bring you her interpretation of what she thinks are her Islamic values and what she wants. So because when you write these kinds of things, people declare you as un-Islamic, as non-Muslim, as anti-national. So it's about reclaiming that identification, saying, well, how do I claim myself, my identity, if I want to have a positionality within this kind of narrative? So, and there are other ones as well. And she, of course, wrote the very famous Chadar and Char Diwari poem. And so they're poems about, like, demanding social justice from the state. Anyway. Yeah, there's like I did Zubanon Ka Bosa is the very famous poem breaking taboos from the collection Badan Darida, and yeah, I don't think you would find that normally in an Urdu collection, so I put that in. And Parveen Shakir is, of course, somebody who was loved by the gatekeepers of Urdu. She writes romantic, well, she's celebrated as a romantic poet, but she does write quite satirical poetry as well. And she, as a civil servant, she's also quite critical of those kind of structures and things. But, it's the thing, what are you celebrated for as a woman? Are you celebrated for being a pretty face and for what you write? And so she was aware of that, and she had this sort of interesting conversation with Fahmida Riaz as well. But yeah, so she, I think she is kind of mocking her own poetry in that sort of verse I've quoted from over there. Your poetry is only khushbu, pleasing to the heart, touching the spirit with a moisture-laden hand, but this will only touch the mind lightly. So it's about, you're not really literary, you're just kind of a genre poet type of thing, if there can be a thing as a genre poet. So the craft and the kind of philosophy is not. Now, Sara Shagufta is somebody who, of course, is a poet from the wrong side of the tracks, not middle class enough to be accepted, and with a life that is too complicated, too many sort of marriages, sexual encounters. So she's seen as somebody who can't really be accepted into the formal sort of world of Urdu poetry. So she's very much on the margins. She feels it. I mean, she's often likened to Sylvia Plath because the story of her suicide. But she also writes, the form that she writes in is quite hard because it's a modernist, more of a modernist form. So that's also not very pleasing for people. And so she's not accepted as much. And Amrita Pritham has done some excellent work on her, on the life and poetry of Sara Shagufta, which is worth reading. Ek Thi Sara. And it's all about how Sara is read. You know, nobody reads her poetry, everybody reads her life. So it's that constant negotiation that women poets have to do about what Parveen Shakir is saying about the art and craft of writing and not being read for what you wear and what you say, but for the work that you do. So she was a little bit too experimental, a little bit too ahead of her time, and a little bit, it was, I mean, it is a bit of a Wild West, I think, for some of these women when they go out into that world. Kishra Nahid is, I think, her poem, Ye Hum Gunahgar Aurtein Hain, she says that's the alternative national anthem of Pakistan. So I think I always love that about her. She's never afraid to claim her position, and I think no one will deny her that position as well. Although she and Intizar Hussain had a really long altercation over a period of time, and she said, well, I was called a na aurat, a not woman. So she's had to face those kinds of challenges because of the writing that she did. But she, as you can see, she's written many collections of poetry. She's also done translations of Simone de Beauvoir's work, The Second Sex, which was banned and then published again under some other name. She's translated Leila Khalid's story. She does everything. She writes about a lot of topics and a lot of things that are happening in Pakistan, and her style is quite different to Fahmida Riaz's. And she experiments with prose poetry. She started off with writing dohe as well, the kind of more towards the Hindi side. So it's really interesting, her use of language and stuff, but she, in the end, goes for quite straightforward realism and quite a close kind of reading of what's going on in the nation. So she has this poem, she has a number of poems that I can quote from, but maybe, there's like the Taliban Se Qibla Ru Guftagu, which was published, a while ago, and it's about her commitment to modernity. So I come back to that point about modernity and her engagement with all of these conversations that are happening in the nation. And as a progressive poet, she really upholds her commitment to secular ideals and a critique of an ideological society that relies on the rules of majoritarianism to establish its power. So I think there's some very moving poems, like there's one, Mujhe Bhai Ne Sangsar Kiya, which is just, a story that is very common to Pakistan, and also, unfortunately, a story that is the only story that sometimes you hear about Pakistan in the West, but it is something that she narrates and that she wants to embed in her work. So she talks about a girl being murdered by her brother because of the boy that she chooses to marry. So it's not an unusual story. It's not, something that is unknown, but it's about sort of giving voice to that. And then she also has travel writing, and she's quite interesting with her travel. Both she and Fahmida have done travel writing, and they have written about 1971 and Bangladesh as well, and their journeys there. And I also look at her engagement with Africa, particularly Kishore Nahid's Fahmida. I didn't see as much writing on Africa in her work, but yeah, so I could go on endlessly, but I thought I would sort of put these quotes there. So Asif Farooqi, the late Asif Farooqi, said if Edward Albee wrote it Urdu and he had written the drama Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf sitting in Pakistan, then he would have called it Who's Afraid of Kishore Nahid. And that was the ghazal that I started with. Kuch यूं ही zard zard si Nahid aaj thi, kuch ordni ka rang bhi khilta hua na tha. Nahid looked paler than pale today. Her dress was also dowdy and dull. So, yeah. And then, yeah, I mean, she then, of course, gets into a lot of trouble with the story, so I don't need to repeat it. But it's just to say that the narrative is always changing. You know, it's about what is feminism to people at different times? What is protest? Who can protest? Why do people protest? And what do those things? So feminist, I think, yeah. She was called out for betraying feminist values and for someone who really was committed as a feminist. It's quite interesting, but those are the contradictions, right? Those are the contradictions of writers. Those are the narratives of writers, and those are also the intergenerational differences as life goes on and changes come in. So the mantle is taken over by somebody else. So I end the book. Because I just wanted to give a snapshot of the 20th century, but I really wanted to talk about the future as well of Urdu and say, where's Urdu headed, you know, in terms of its future directions? And I think that is, the multilingual is so important to it, and as well the preserve of a kind of very genteel language. It can't really sustain it in the 21st century. It's impossible, especially in the world that we live in with social media and all that has happened with the Aurat March as well. But I mean, you can say that might be a bubble in the social media. Digital culture might be a bubble that's only available to a chosen few, not everybody. But I think things are in the 21st century changing, and you do have regional voices. I mean, I talk a little bit about Eva B. and the kind of narrative that comes out of Layari and places like that Urdu needs to have those narratives as well as central to it, so that we get a different kind of story of Pakistan than the one that we perhaps have in those writers that have been canonized and that we've read over and over again, because there is a relationship with the state there that we do need to think about and look at and reflect on as we move forward. What I've seen certainly tells me that this is what's happening. So, but anyway, that's maybe the next project, or maybe a project for someone else to do. But I'll stop at that point. Thank you so much for listening so patiently.